When will One Piece end? This is the question that all One Piece fans have been dying to know, as in 2022, Oda claimed that he would end One Piece in 3 years. Yet considering the rate of chapter releases has dwindled to barely 30 a year, and it's taken over 2 years just to complete Egghead Island, there is no feasible way to then also complete Elbaf, Laugh Tale, and the gigantic final war, even in the next 5 years, considering that much story can't be reasonably covered in only 150 chapters. So then when will One Piece actually end, and is there even any way for us to figure it out? Well, yes. We can actually predict with a fairly high degree of confidence that at the pace that it is going, One Piece will end in about 7.5 years in the year 2032, likely around chapter 1350. This is based on analyzing several factors. First, while Oda is unreliable with the number of years that he claims for the ending, he is actually very reliable when it comes to sticking to certain chapter numbers for hitting each story milestone. Second, we have hit a newfound, fairly consistent rate of chapter releases per year, which we can use to realistically plot time going forward. And third, there is a fairly consistently reliable method to estimate the length of arcs post-time skip, which can be applied to the upcoming arcs. But before we get into it, make sure to subscribe. So to begin with, when Oda makes his claims about 3 years or 5 years as he's routinely done in the past, it's unlikely that even Oda believes those claims, because the way that Oda actually plots out the narrative of One Piece by chapter count tells a very different story. See, ever since the time skip, we can observe the story of One Piece being split into very clear milestones by chapter count. Too many readers obsess over the exact numbers, like, on chapter 900 exactly something huge will happen, as the exact chapter 900 or 800 or 1100 and so on is not what it's really about. For any author writing such a huge story, it would be pretty much impossible to always stick to an exact chapter number for certain events happening. Obviously, Oda tries to do cool little bits of symbolism with his chapter numbers whenever he possibly can, but that doesn't seem to be how he's plotting out the larger movements of the story. Rather, what is clear is that Oda uses certain chapter counts as rough milestones for when major sections of his story should be ending and beginning. Specifically, the broader story seems to be plotted out in rough increments of 50 and 100. At about chapter 600, the post-time skip begins. At about chapter 650, Fishman Island ends and Punk Hazard begins. At about chapter 700, Punk Hazard ends and Dressrosa begins. Dressrosa then runs for about 100 chapters from chapter 700 to 800. At about chapter 800, Zou begins, and from 800 to 900, Oda fits in the Zou arc and the long Whole Cake Island arc. At about chapter 900, Whole Cake Island ends and Wano begins. Wano then stretches about 150 chapters to chapter 1050. If we want to be specific, Act 1 and 2 take till about chapter 950, and Act 3 ends around 1050. Basically, it's pretty clear that Oda has major milestones of completing certain sections of his story by roughly certain chapter counts, generally in increments of 50 or 100, that he has been consistently sticking to. I don't think it's a coincidence that Punk Hazard and Fishman Island took 100 chapters to complete, that Dressrosa took 100 chapters to complete, that Zou and Whole Cake Island took 100 chapters to complete, that it took 50 chapters for Act 1 and 2 of Wano, and then 100 chapters for Act 3 of Wano to complete. Because the story has been completing these major sections in very consistent increments of 50 and 100, that suggests to me that Oda does have a very clear pace in mind for the story that he's actually been successfully sticking to for the most part. And whenever we experience plotlines that seem kind of rushed or cut short early, that's indicative of Oda realizing that he needs to trim some of the fat of his current arc if he's going to hit the next chapter count milestone that he's been working towards. As such, I don't think that Oda's just freewheeling it at the moment with no real idea of when the story's going to end, despite what his inconsistent yearly predictions seem to suggest. After all, Oda does like to troll readers to some degree, and it's generally just a good marketing tool to build hype by telling readers that the story is at its end, when really that ending is going to take longer than he's letting on. Based on how Oda has been pacing out the story with major increments planned out so far, my guess is that we will see around chapter 1200 marking the end of Elbaf, as that is likely the next arc after Egghead and would allow Oda to conclude another nice 150 chapter increment of both Egghead and Elbaf. Now, many of you might be saying, wait Morge, isn't that too long for Elbaf? Well, to begin with, time in between arcs is being accounted for here as well. But more importantly, the classic problem that I've seen throughout the New World is that readers have consistently severely underestimated the length of arcs post-time skip. If you go back and read old discussions, most readers believed Whole Cake Island would be about 50 chapters when the arc began, yet it ended up being 80. Most readers believed Wano would be around 100 to 120 chapters when it began, and it turned out to be 150. Not too long ago, most readers believed that Egghead would be a short 20-chapter arc when it began. Then a lot of readers changed their predictions to believing that Egghead would be about 40 or so chapters as the plot became more clear. And yet at this point, Egghead has hit 60 chapters and is still going, guaranteeing it to end up as one of the top 4 longest arcs in the entire story. Meaning that's how badly readers underestimate arc lengths at this point. An arc that most believed would be one of the shortest in the story when it began turned out to be one of the longest One Piece arcs ever. And there's a reason that readers have become so bad at estimating arc lengths. If you look at the top 4 longest arcs in One Piece, the commonality that all of them have is that they are all post-timeskip. The reality is that post-timeskip arcs are generally a lot longer than pre-timeskip, because Oda is usually having to incorporate a lot more elements each arc. We have to get to a new setting, learn about the island, its primary inhabitants, the running conflict, and so on, just like pre-timeskip. But now we also usually have lots of additional elements that then get added in from outside the island. Like in Dressrosa, it wasn't just about the Riku royal family and their conflict with Doflamingo. The revolutionaries and the marines and the Blackbeard pirates and the Grand Fleet were all added into the arc even though they are not native to the setting, or the conflict's history. In Wano, it wasn't just about Momonosuke and the Scabbards rising up to liberate Wano from Kaido. We had a ton of supernovas and a whole nother Yonko also thrown into the arc. Vegapunk was supposed to be the only inhabitant of Egghead, but then we also got Bonnie and Kuma and the Giants and CP0, not to mention frequently cutting away to other storylines going on like the Marines or the Revolutionaries. It is very unlikely that Elbaf is just going to be some nice 40-chapter arc that's just a quiet little Davy Back fight between the Straw Hats and the red-haired pirates, because that's just not how arcs are written anymore. Oda is always layering multiple storylines because there are just too many ongoing macro story elements that need to be continually developed. I do not see a world where the long built-up Elbaf is somehow shorter than Punk Hazard. It's already clear that the citizens of Elbaf are going to matter as we've had so much talk about Loki, but at the same time it's clear that the red-haired pirates are going to be involved, meaning that already we're looking at multiple lines of drama being layered into the arc. Maybe even Kid's storyline isn't done yet. And even if Elbaf itself somehow just focuses on the Straw Hats, the Giants, and the red-haired pirates, that would mean that there would be a ton of cutaways we would need throughout the arc to develop the ongoing storylines of groups in the outside world, meaning the Marines, Revolutionaries, Blackbeard pirates, Cross Guild, and so on, as we've already seen Oda doing throughout Egghead Island. So estimating that Egghead and Elbaf together will take till about chapter 1200 to conclude seems well within reason, considering the in-between arc segments that we are also likely to get. And so that leaves us with just 2 major arcs that we know are on the horizon, Laugh Tale and the Final War. Now the good news is that with these 2 arcs, the big difference is that unlike past arcs, we will no longer need as much time to develop new settings. Unlike a Dressrosa or a Wano, where we need to get to a certain location and learn a lot about all the citizens of the new setting and their plight, at least with Laugh Tale and the Final War, there aren't really any new casts of characters tied to a new setting that we will need to meet and get to know. In fact, Elbaf may very well be the last time in One Piece that we have an arc where we need to spend time getting to know a whole new set of island citizens. That's because, come the time of Laugh Tale and the Final War, both arcs should just be all the macro storylines of One Piece finally coming together, with only established players, the Straw Hats, the Blackbeard pirates, Revolutionaries, Cross Guild, the Marines, and so on, finally resolving their storylines. As such, if I were to compare my estimate for the Final War compared to the Wano arc, Wano took 150 chapters total, but only about 60 of those chapters were its final battle, meaning a lot of time was spent on setup, since we actually had to learn a lot about the island and the people of Wano itself. I feel like the Final War will have a longer actual battle than the Onigashima battle, but there should be much less setup time, especially as the events building to the final battle are already going to be happening within the context of all the arcs from here on anyway, as seen in Egghead. It's kind of like how the Marineford War didn't require 100 chapters beforehand of establishing a new setting and a new cast of characters, the way the Wano arc had to before the Onigashima War, because for a large-scale world war, it's exactly that, it's a world war. The build-up to this type of a war just happens organically over the course of prior arcs. There's no new setting that we need to take time to develop and learn about. And assuming that Laugh Tale is not going to be an island with a bunch of citizens, as that seems very unlikely, then that would mean that we won't have to learn a lot about a bunch of new characters in Laugh Tale, meaning that Laugh Tale could also just focus on established players, be that the Straw Hats and the Blackbeard Pirates, Cross Guild, or whoever else is meant to be involved there. As such, Laugh Tale is the first arc in a while that could feasibly be on the shorter side, possibly even just 50 chapters. And the final war could all be written within 100 chapters if we assume that it will be a longer battle than Onigashima, but will require much less setup time. Essentially, whereas most post-time skip arcs have been longer than people expected because they have to establish new settings and new casts of characters while also handling many different established plot lines and factions, Laugh Tale and the Final War are the first arcs in a long time that should not have to set up a whole new setting and cast of characters, so a lower chapter count would actually be feasible. Note, if you think that the Blackbeard conflict will take place in the Final War and Laugh Tale won't really have any conflict at all, then in that case Laugh Tale might genuinely be very short like Zoe, but then the final battle would simply be longer, so the total should still come out to about the same thing. As such, overall, I think that optimistically, it would be possible for Oda to write both Laugh Tale and the Final War in 150 chapters, meaning I believe One Piece will end at about chapter 1350. There is one potential route where I could see One Piece ending as early as chapter 1300, but it would require a bold storytelling move that I think is highly unlikely. Though you can hear what that is in my weekly podcast by supporting me on Patreon, link in the description below. And finally, if we look at the rate of release of chapters recently, it's been dwindling down to barely over 30, and considering that Oda seems more likely to take breaks nowadays, straying away from his usual schedule of 3 weeks of chapter followed by 1 week of break, at best we can expect about 30 chapters per year. As such, if we're lucky and maintain a rate of 30 chapters per year, with a hopeful end in sight at about chapter 1350, then I believe we could see One Piece end in just over 7.5 years, in the year 2032. We're in the home stretch, but we've still got a good ways to go. So let me know what year you think One Piece will end in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video then definitely like and subscribe. And if you want to hear one route I could imagine as to how One Piece could end even earlier than that, then you can get my extended thoughts on my weekly podcast by supporting me on Patreon, link in the description below.